are stewards of those collections, and we have to keep them safe, and of course keeps the stuff that comes in through our doors safe, whether it's on loan or not. So, and so I think all of that will be talked about. But the one thing I wanted to touch on is what I like about the collection management policy, if I get to encounter one at some place, is I love it when it has sort of a history of the collections, and it has a little background on the collections that how has it, I mean, whether it's 2,000 items or 10 million or whatever it is, how did the things come to be? Were they? I mean, I know this is the hard part, right? Because not everybody knows where everything came from. It just showed up here on the doorstep 30 years ago. There's a lot of that. But I always like it when the collection management policy kind of covers the history of the collecting of that institution. How long has it been collecting stuff? Where does the stuff come from? Were people going out and seeking it? Or was it just dropped off? Is it all there? Is everything there relevant to what we're supposed to do? Do we actually want to look into de-accessioning? So it kind of gives a nice background. Again, talking about that instance where you're the next person to come down the line. If you were to open that document, you'd be like, oh, okay, this gives me an idea of where the collections are, and why is that room upstairs filled with all those things, and so that's the part of it that I secretly like the most. I know that's a little selfish, but
since this is ATALM meetings, I know that different tribes do it differently. In some places, the archive and the library are totally separate departments and wouldn't necessarily be involved. In other places, that's all in one. And so you would want to perhaps expand from just artifacts to more intangible heritage with recordings and photographs and archive documents. So I just, it may not be what you do at home, but some tribes do that. So keep that in mind. You got all in one. Okay, so you see that, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that we realized that museums have different kind of collections that require different kinds of care and use and access. So this is the time and place of this document to really outline and define what your collection, the different collections are, and isolate sort of how you are going to, if they have different management and treatment and use and access, et cetera, policies and restrictions, you really carve that out very explicitly in the policy, even if it's just one big policy, really break it down in those ways. I think that's really critical.
And then it really is a reference tool, both for everyone who's there, current staff and so on, and also new and incoming, and that's been coming up a lot. I mean, every museum has people coming and going and keeping that institutional memory alive. Many tribal museums, at least some, bring in collections from the Smithsonian and other places, and may also loan out. And the topic of kind of cultural appropriateness of handling and care, if that is in that core document, then it's there to be found by the next collection manager or the next, whomever, and also can help you negotiate loans with an outside institution if it comes up. Yeah?
Do you have, or is there somewhere policies?
Yeah, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, there's a number of organizations like AAM, ASLH, the Association for State and Local History, and other organizations often have sample documents or templates. I also encourage you to call your peer institutions and share what they have. But the key thing is to use them only as guides rather than just blindly looking at one that's sort of like me and pasting your name into it. Really just taking them and using them as the starting point to have the conversation internally about how it's relevant to you and what your issues are. So all these documents need to be very tailored to your particular situation. So I highly encourage not to reinvent the wheel and
Exactly.
to look at examples and templates, but use it, exercise some caution, and just blindly appropriating them. So that
But it can be super helpful just to see what the subjects are, maybe what order they're put in, then you go, well, that doesn't make sense, let's do it this way. But because, at least my experience, they tend to be sort of big. I mean, they're very detailed, and so it is super helpful to
That's
look
because
at an
registrars
example.
make them.
Huh?
Yeah.
I know, well, I didn't say that, but.
I think, I'm not sure if the ATALM site has them as well, but I'm betting that if you were to email Susan or ATALM or anything, they might, although it might not be an online database of the tribal museum, I'm this size museum, I'm in this part of the country, I'm tribal, et cetera, they might at least be able to, I would think that ATALM would be a good connecting source to other documents too. Then you might have to go call the other museum and ask them for it, but at least it would be like a segue into a similar institution.
It really needs to tie to your mission statement too, because, I mean, you want to use that to defend, I mean, sometimes it's a crutch, sometimes it's a club. I'll give you a Nevada example. In Elko, Nevada, there used to be a wonderful little accredited history museum, and it was very good. And then some guy came along and wanted to give them dozens and dozens of stuffed animals that he had killed around the world. And they built one of those mountains of death with the mountain goats on it in there in a badly matched building, and the whole place stinks like formaldehyde. And it drove them clear off their mission. And I don't, to this day, know why they took that. But if they had had a really good collections management policy, they would never have gone off their mission to take the mountain of death. And so you have to be careful, but it can serve you. It also is a beacon to your friends and relatives, maybe, of if you put out the things that you should have to accomplish your mission that you don't have. If you publish the negative inventory and say, you know, we're missing this kind of a textile from that time period, or, you know, we really need some photographs of that old business or something, that can help you also. I don't think we have a negative.
No, you should absolutely list your collection needs.
Right.
Should be a section in there. What do you need? What do you want? What's missing? You know, there might be a important person or an event that's just never, for whatever reason, you've never gotten the records or the photographs or the collection items from there. They might be out there, and somebody else may be like, I have this stuff and I don't even. Where can I give it to? The way ours was more like, you know, stuff we'd like to get. I mean, in layman's terms, it was, you know, stuff we hope to get someday. Like we knew it wasn't so much about particular collection, although sometimes that's the case too. I want the so-and-so photographic collection that you know is out there. It was more about, like, we didn't have, in the Seminole tribe, we didn't have enough stuff on the cattle industry. The cattle industry was very big. Eventually we got some more stuff in, but that was an area that was very important to the tribal members, and it was just, it was from, you know, like 30s, 40s, 50s, and we just mentioned it as something that we'd like to have to make the collections more comprehensive.
Yeah, I think at the beginning of your policy, you might want to have a scope of collections, which
Right.
is sort of, it's tied to what Anne was talking about, the history of the collections, and then I was saying kind of how you outline what collections you have. Talk about the scope of your collections and where they're strong or where they're weak. And you could also have a collecting plan as an additional
You
document
could.
that can really be super focused on, like in the next 3 to 5 years or something, what you're really targeting in a more
Don't you have a book?
in-depth way. Yeah.
Doesn't AM have a book about that?
Collecting
Plans,
plans,
I'm
yeah,
sure.
we do. Yeah, and there's actually quite a bit of literature on some really great books. I think All Things Great and Small is a publication by John Simmons that's basically sort of a how-to and guideline on writing collections management policies. It's one I highly recommend. All Things Great and Small by John Simmons. Kind of your collections management policy is easy to start with kind of what you have now. But I do think what we talked about at the very beginning of the first session, our part of an interpretive
Yeah,
plan,
absolutely.
is the perfect
have stuff for, we can still interpret it. We might have to borrow the things, we might have to go out and ask for them, but he keeps thinking about, I'm gonna write it based on what's already here, and I'm like, no, because some of the stuff we might take secondhand, we might, so.
Well,
It'd be great if it was the other way around, but it's not always.
well, and I might, it's a different, very different example, but it's been in the news a lot lately, and you might find some inspiration in the creation of the newly opened African American History and Culture Museum in Washington, D.C. And that institution, decades in the planning, but had no collection, but they had a profound and powerful and challenging history to tell, and the word got out, and then they intentionally sought objects and associated stories, and it takes time, but for the Apache history, if that word got out, there are undoubtedly materials in the most unlikely places, and you might find them that way, and it's an interesting narrative for how that collection was put together, and it might be relevant, and you can find in the New York Times or Washington Post or the museum itself.
Yeah. I'm thinking even of nearby institutions that you could visit because they have bits and pieces of the story but not the whole, and that would be, there's a little museum in Wilcox. Yeah, because it has a lot of the political stuff in it. The Chiricahua National Monument, the Park Service stuff, Amarin Foundation in Dragoon nearby, and then Arizona Historical Society has huge photo collections from that time period. So there's probably resources that you could work with.
Just 1 second. I would say that if you collections management policy is not just to govern the what's coming in, what's going out of your institution, and how you take care of the things that you own. It should have sections in it if you are bringing collections in on loan, how it should encompass the care and issues, your obligations to them while they're in your custody as well. So even if you don't physically own them, things that are in your custody should be addressed in some way in your collections management policy. Do you guys want to talk about the deaccessioning sort of issues that should be captured in the plan?
And sometimes, of course, you're going to, eventually someone's going to give you a giant collection of something you want, and there'll be 4 or 5 things that might be Eskimo or something, and so you need to have a way to responsibly place those somewhere else. And you really have to do it publicly. There really needs to be a process where perhaps the curator or you as the director give the rationale for why something should be removed from the collection, and your governing body or whoever makes that decision, and it's all recorded so that you can review it in the future. And the fairest thing is a trade or a gift to another institution. Failing that, a sale to another institution. Failing that, a public auction, but never just selling it to your board chairman's cousin or something. That get in huge trouble for that kind of a thing. You could probably elaborate.
Well, I'm not an expert in the collections area per se, but among the areas where institutions have gotten in trouble too is to sell collections because you're running low on payroll or something. When people donate, or individuals or institutions, it's for long-term care intention and purposes, and so a deaccession policy defines, as Art said, typically the ideal, which would be a swap institution to institution, but to be extremely careful about the use of funds. And there is a long list of directors and others who've gotten into serious trouble for looking at the collection as a monetary resource that can help cover operating costs. So that's kind of the big the big one to
and
watch.
The direct care is still a conversation.
The key ethical principles are that you only use
from staff from within the rest of the tribe. But at any rate, it was the same group of people that met to accept, once we had a collection management policy, to accept collections in, yes or no, and to deaccession them, yes or no. And the deaccessioning process is much more rigorous, much more, meticulous, and as Hart said, you have to due diligence. You've got to do your due diligence in trying to find the proper home and really making sure that you are going to deaccession it. Are you sure? And if you've got an interpretive plan, are you sure we can't use this in some sort of capacity in the future? But then documenting the heck out of the process from the minute you decide to deaccession that item to the minute that it's gone. But being this committee, it was sort of, it wasn't just left to staff, or it wasn't just left to the tribal members or the council. It was a nice group of people that did it. And like I said, we documented copiously what we did.
Yeah. And for a tribal community, maybe one of the direct questions, would be, is it appropriate for this to leave our community?
Yeah. It doesn't have to be at the museum. We had some tribal government buildings that wanted, we didn't deaccession it, but they also, sometimes they have artwork, sometimes they have interpretive, sometimes they have educational programs for seniors and kids. There's a whole, the entire education department. Sometimes, there's other connections with things other than the physical museum that's there.
For direct care, one of the extreme examples that they used to use was, you've got a big old museum, it's got 10 million things in it, and the roof leaks, and you don't have the money. Would you sell one old painting for millions of dollars to fix the roof and save the other 9.999 objects instead? And that's the kind of justification you'd need to make for direct care. You had a question?
You usually have a donor form, and if the person knows the provenance of the information, sometimes if the person has the box and they don't know anything about it, sometimes they have the box and they do know what it is, and they can tell you their grandmother gave it to them and what year and all that. So I guess it kind of depends how much information they have. But if you have the collection management policy kind of written out and everybody's got a good knowledge of it, should be able to have a pretty good idea relatively quickly about whether, because it comes down to, we're talking about relevance to your mission and your interpretive thing. We're also talking about space. Can you take care of it? Do you have the staff that know how to take care of it? What if it's like a piece of machinery or something? So it's really not, there's probably 7 or 8 questions that you should go boom, 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 and it's up to you whether you miss 1 or 2 of them and you keep it. It's a tough conversation, but sometimes you just have to be honest and say, listen, it's not relevant, we don't have the space, we don't have the stuff, thank you so much, it might be better off somewhere else. That's a hard conversation to have, but you do have to have it.
For a big piece of machinery, it's probably different than if it was a valuable artwork that they took a tax deduction for. Because then that opens up a whole other thing for them that they would have to, go back on that.
And I mentioned in that first session that right at the end that very important to make these policies be transparent. You're going to put these policies on your website, and they're a great educational tool. The donor with that box of stuff sees that it's not you and saying personally, we don't want that. It's not a person, sort of an individual personal thing. It's here's our policy, and this is why we can't take it. And that can really help the difficult conversation you might actually have too.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody here had a question. So I hand up. Yes.
Your policy that you would know what to say. It's outside your scope or outside your
Right.
area.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's important to have the policy in place.
Right.
There's, again, since this is ATALM, some exciting things going on. Anybody from Alaska in here? So in Juneau, the SLAM project, where they're actually physically facility. And I haven't seen their policies, but I would imagine there's some interesting conversations between those three types of collections. So the box might not have anything for you, but it might for the archive, so.
And I at Harper's Ferry, I did the accreditation visit for them years ago. No, sorry, yeah, and when we visited the collection storage facility where their stuff went in, I forget what town it was, nearby. This was also the facility that took in, talking about a collection management policy, they take in all the stuff that gets left at the Vietnam Memorial and everything. And the guy shows me, you know, and he shows me, and he just row after row after row of stuff, and we were like, how do you decide what to keep? And they wrote a policy, but he admitted, and this was 4 or 5 years ago, that they were going to have to readdress the policy, because when they first wrote it, it was, we're going to take anything that gets left behind at the wall. And you know, people have left motorcycles, I mean, all kinds of things, big things, small things, food, you know, all kinds of things. And so he said, they admitted that due to space and a few other things, they were going to have to start to readdress their collection management policy in terms of that, because what they said at first, they didn't realize, or they did, but maybe not to that extent, over the years, how much stuff was going to get left at such a powerful monument like that. So you really have to think long term about what you're willing to agree to take in now, and that could change over the years.
But at least you have something
Yeah.
written down, and I think that's an important thing. Most people think if this is an overwhelming task, to, you know, you got to start somewhere, right? And I did just one of the things I think is really important in these list of required elements. We kind of talked about acquisitioning, sort of coming in and going out, accessioning, deaccessioning, loans, things that are coming in and coming out that you don't necessarily own, and obviously the whole scope of collections care, the different kinds of care that things might need. And inventories and documentation is very important to put that down. Really, your collections policy is helping you have ensure that you have physical and intellectual control over the things that are in your custody. Because you decided to be a museum, you decided to take on the obligation of stewarding these objects, regardless of who you know, technically owns them. You have decided to be the steward of them, and you have very important responsibilities in that respect. But this last one, I want to dig into a little bit more access and or use of the collections, because I think there's a whole another level of complexity and uniqueness in tribal museums or museums with Native American collections regarding access and use and even ownership. So maybe, Anne, could I start with you to talk a little bit about what are some of those unique things that you might need to address in your CMP?
Well, certainly for access, we had at Totiki, there was, and this was delineated by, you know, tribal elders and culture, was certain things could be accessed by men, certain things could be accessed by women, and that one of the discussions that came up was, well, does that also apply to non-tribal men and women? Because, you know, the non-tribal people were working there as well, so we had to tackle that discussion. We ended up with the answer as yes, because as non-tribal people working at a tribal museum, it was sort of understood that you know, you want to adhere to those cultural norms, regardless of whether they're your cultural norms. You want to respect the ones of the places that you work. And we also had to deal with access in terms of medicine. That's what they referred to it as. So once or twice a year, because these new items were coming in, and they the cultural norm was that they had to have you know, medicine performed, and it basically included us having to have smoke, you know, in the buildings, and they would do their ceremony. I mean, I don't know the ceremony because I wasn't tribal, but we had to allow the collections to be accessed by the tribal elders and the people who could do those ceremonies, and we had to turn off the fire alarms for being called fire, you know, and let it all happen, because that's what was would allow us to then have the collections be ultimately accessible to the larger tribal community, because a lot of tribal members had to have that ceremony performed before they felt comfortable being around the items. Even though we had our internal policy, you know, they're not necessarily reading the policy to that level. So there was some of the registrars that was a little difficult for people at first, and I was like, you know, first and foremost, you have to respect the cultural things that have. So sometimes they also had to leave the buildings. The things had to leave the building, or go outside, or sit in the sunlight, or be in situations that they wouldn't normally have been in. And so we had to write that in there and try to be as specific as possible. So instead of just saying cultural activities will take place, we got pretty specific and explained that what was allowed with the collections and what was permissible, trying to open it up as much to allow the activities to take place place so that the collections weren't then out of reach, or so that so that the tribal members would want to be in contact with the collections and use them and have them find them accessible and not find them standoffish. So.
I have a question on that. Did you do it by items or?
No, it was in the, everything had to be one physical building.
No, by the item, oh, like, it's the medicine, did you do each of the items?
No, the medicine was,
Do it, or
it was
just
performed, yeah, on the entire physical structure. So we had to go wherever there were collection items, we had to bring them into the one physical building once or twice a year, and the medicine was performed. I mean, again, I don't know the details because I wasn't part of the ceremony, I'm not privy to it, but medicine, as I understand it, was performed on the entire, by including everything in that physical structure, it was covered that way.
So are you asking in the policy, do you actually sort of itemize
Yes.
which items might
More, yeah,
have
how do
to be?
we-
Oh, no, the
Like down to
policy,
the granular level on that?
For medicine items, or secret items, or?
no, in this case, the medicine was performed on anything coming in the doors. So that was a little bit easier for us to explain. But yeah, there could be situations, I'm sure, in tribes where it could be specific per type of item.
So you might have to break down the different, there's different types of items
Okay.
would have different, ceremonial, sacred, et cetera.
Yeah, we didn't
things.
have that, but yeah, that could happen, I'm sure.
Right.
And
You would break it down in
Yeah.
policy.
Right.
But we, of course, know specifics on anything and what the ceremony is, you know, nothing,
No.
yeah, just, yeah, exactly, yeah, that's,
there
yeah.
some tribal museums who, there's like a couple other levels, where perhaps clan objects are stored. They're part of the museum collection in terms of care, but then they are checked out at appropriate times of the year to be used publicly. So that, in some places that's seen as a prime remedy for things being stolen out of storage, and sold to Europe or, whatever, the things that are in the news these days. Then there's another level where it's almost like a storage locker, where families can bring their jewelry in or something and, keep it under lock and key in between public events, if they're worried about that. So, there might be subsets of your collections policy that would deal with those access questions. There's also, I don't think it's on here, but very important now is intellectual property rights, and making sure that you have copyrights, that you have registered your ownership in a public way to your photos, to your recordings. There's another session, I think, unfortunately going on right now about an academic who found a manuscript in a university archive and elected after consulting with the tribal council over years, elected to go ahead and publish it without their approval. So, there are things that have gone away from communities, and so I think making sure that you, not only do you have title or own your collections, but do you have intellectual property rights where they have to ask you and get approval to use them.
And
Yeah.
even if you do you still want to share it? Because it might just have political ramifications that you
Some
might.
of the possessions, are illegal. What they're doing with, folklore,
Yeah, the Library of Congress.
tapes, which ones shared, general, the United States one. That all works in database.
And of course, the other thing that drives registrars crazy, if there are living beings in cases and they have to be fed cornmeal every once in a while, that, that's both an religious obligation and a registrar and curator's worry for conservation practices.
Pest management.
Yeah, it's, so, but most, tribes who have that requirement have found ways, on their own to accommodate for that.
On our recreation, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, but, I've got an artist that,
are some very sharp copyright lawyers in Tucson. And if you put it together right and they do steal, then you can, they can go after them. But, yeah. It's a good issue.
Do any of you have any other comments sort of about, collections in terms of consumptive use or how they might, in terms of on exhibit or other usage that might be unique or something to think about? Or use in programs, we kind of covered some of that, but.
Yeah.
I think the, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think the idea is to balance, there's, sort of these basic elements that you wanna include, again, so a lot of this, we talk about framework of these documents, but you have to make them your own and layer in and try to remember, sort of the spirit and the intention of the policy is to ensure that you're doing the best to ensure that the collections are being, cared for, and they will be there for the long term, if that's their intention, or if they're there for consumptive use, then what's the policies that are, ensuring that they're used properly. So you kind of have to balance the cultural specifics and your own unique situation with sort of the framework and the core ideas and spirit behind it.
The other part of a management policy for you might include how you manage the relationships with the museums. What I was hearing this weekend is that there are lots of museums where there's an attempt to repatriate ancestors, and because of cultural beliefs about the deceased, they want them taken care of, but they're not going to take them home and bury them because there's no provision in their culture to do that. And so they're staying in museums kind of in custody or care. So there's another relationship outside your museum that might have to be managed, maybe through your collections or your ethics code. And that's apparently, coming, there's a lot of that going on. And like at the Gilcrease, Jim Pepper Henry could tell you about that, and the Smithsonian certainly. So, not everyone can go home, but they need to be taken care of where they are. So that's an extra wrinkle.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously kind of goes without saying that you would have a human remains section where you either say, we do deal with them, we don't, they're allowed on the property, they're not, or that's biological specimens happens in a lot of museums, but specifically I think that you might, burial of human remains tied back to a little bit to NAGPRA, but because it's most likely going to come up at a lot of tribal museums, and I think it's good to know. And that can also change with government. I mean, change with who the figureheads are from time to time.
But I think it's important for non-tribal museums or where I have worked, but always with tribal collections, that the consulting process, the advisory process, is important for getting things done. It is also time-consuming and expensive, and I think the outside museums, and I can say that the Burke did this and got grants and so on, but there has to be a recognition for the time, involved in that whole relationship. In order to do it right, everyone is putting in a lot of extra hours, and it has to be done, but increasingly there might be ways to have it actually be part of your work.
From what I've seen, most of the bands all have in some form.
And they're not all in the museums.
Fortunately, I can go to KCRC and say, okay, remains or cremains, that's your department.
Some do, and yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are some tribal, well, I know, it just depends, I guess, whether or not they're, if the stance is right off the bat that nothing's going to come in, then the repatriation is.
Well, normally, under tax budget, you go to the bands, tribal councils.
Right, but they're going to go to everybody who has a cultural affiliation with that item or human remains, which is sometimes more than one tribe.
But it's sort of like the archives, or, in some tribes, the FIPO is in the museum,
And
sometimes not. Sometimes the repatriation committee works through the museum, sometimes not. So
or there is no TIPO.
or there is none, yeah. So it's another question.
Yeah, what are the qualifications of my case being a person or establishment to receive the perpetuated items, not human remains, but cultural items considered
Sacred materials.
Pardon?
Well, that's-
Yeah.
In my case, I've got a battle on both ends. The object, for example, is a Apache war cat. After it's been received, there's going to be tribal members that are going to say that's a ceremonial and sacred item, needs to be either buried. However, not all Apache war cats were used for ceremony. My mom used to make them, and I was fortunate enough to have a little bit of knowledge of them. But some were used for different purposes, like medicine man cat or war cat. So they fall into different categories, the object itself. And I'm afraid that it might fall into the wrong cat, might fall into a medicine man cat category and get hurt instead of being used for educational purposes.
I mean, I think the only way that you can do it is that somebody, either yourself or somebody makes the decision about who the ultimate authority is on the the disposition of it. Whether that's a medicine person or the tribal lead, tribal council or the head person in the government, or maybe they pass it on to you. But it does have to, somebody has to make that decision. I mean, I guess it could be done in committee, although sometimes, as you know, group discussions in committee things can be harder to come to a consensus on. But when we would always acquiesce to who was there was a particular clan that was in charge of medicine, and then there was a sort of just a person who was the elder, who was the respected person who was, I don't know if they were probably officially chosen in some way to be the representative, and that's who we would do as much of the due diligence internally with the staff, but that's who we went to for, okay, here's our two options, or three options, what should we do?
And then, the institution you go to is gonna ask you those same questions.
And maybe they come to the decision after a while. There were some things, not on repatriation, but there were some topics where they said, when this comes up in the future, museum folks, you deal with it. And if it comes to repatriation or human remains, we'll deal with it. So we tried to draw those boundaries, but I would do the back and forth a couple of times. Again, being a non-tribal, I would do that. It might be a little different for you.
And I think these are, the example we're talking about are things that, again, have to take some time to think out, and all these issues should be articulated in your policy in terms of things coming in, things going out, what you borrow, et cetera. Have a section in there on process in terms of who are the decision makers about these, because there could be different, as Anne's explaining,
all I know, from people who've been involved is that be prepared for many evenings of long conversations.
Right. I'd say that, well, for one of the early things I said in the first session is, we talked about it takes time to do this process, is there are no shortcuts, and some of these do take, a lot of iterations to work through, and as the more you think about it, the more things that they spin off that you realize, they encompass. So, and I think what we were talking about is a good segue into one of the questions I wanted to ask the panel is, when it comes to writing or revising the collections management policy, should it just be the collections management staff that seems to, who else needs to be involved in the conversation and be part of the process and be familiar with what's in it? Do you want to tackle that?
No, it should not just be the collections. The collections staff are real experts in the field, but certainly throughout the museum, ultimately everyone is working for the collection and working with the collection, and it extends out into the community and your governance. So I think you need a committee, review committee or whatever that cuts across lines within the institution for good reasons. And again, I always go back to the practical, but a collection policy is pretty technical. It's pretty long. Often there are a lot of do's and don'ts in it, and the only people who've really internalized that might be the registrar and maybe the collection manager, but the rest just don't know those things. Often a director is signing off on ultimate paperwork, or the head of the board or whatever, and they need to know these things. So again, that periodic revision and discussion is just really helpful for ongoing education purposes, so we know what we're doing and why, and where the pitfalls are, because there are challenging areas.
You're headed into territory also, though, which is not doctrinaire. Yes, no, do, don't. You're headed into cosmology, history, philosophy, politics, nuance, and that's not the same thing as a checklist. And so, those are the discussions that you almost have to have up front before the right people can even, vet a doctrinaire policy.
Right. It almost ties back to the ethics, the values conversation, the mission at the beginning of the other session about sort of the big ideas and principles and of the whole organization. You have to have all that kind of stuff settled before you can distill it down into this sort of technical document like the collections management policy or even the emergency plan. So,
I might recommend that a good way, talking about evaluating it and how often do you look at it. Collection staff are gonna maybe look at this all the time. Everybody else is gonna be less frequent. I know it sounds silly a little bit, but in terms of training, it might be good to almost do scenarios and tabletops with people who are gonna be using this plan to say, okay, nobody's ever brought a bear claw necklace in, but what if they did? What would we do? And try to have a couple of those at least once or twice a year, especially with the collection staff, to just play devil's advocate on what could possibly happen. Because I guarantee you, if you think nobody's going to bring you human remains or something, they will eventually, or it may even be somewhere and somebody doesn't even know it yet. So in terms of training and how often you look at it and review it, I think that the collection staff should have. I mean, and I don't know if everybody has designated. Now I work at a place now where there's no collection staff. There's 5 of us. We do everything. I'm the collection staff as much as the curator is, and he's the tour guide as much as I am. So that might not be relevant to you, but if you have anybody that's involved in owning this policy, it might be good to do a little practice. Talk about it. Talk about what could possibly come in the door, and don't always be like, no, we just have these 5 things. This is what we always do. To figure it out, because I guarantee you'll run into it somewhere.
I want to say this, I visit lots of museums, and I would have to say that because of IMLS and conferences like ATALM, I find that many, if not most, tribal museums actually take better care of their stuff than their size equivalents in the general population of museums. We went the other day to Wahugum Key, to the archives and the collections area, and it was, an old building, top notch, bursting at the the seams, and they're actually using they're giving the best care possible, but they know that long-term they need a new facility. And so they're using their situation, look, we're taking care of things, but there's just so much, and every time the city of Phoenix grows, we get more. And so we're gonna need to plan ahead, and that relates back to this morning about how your parts of the strategic plan tie together. And, space, they're planning they're planning for 40% or 50% more space than they have right now, just because. And, so I congratulate tribal museums for coming to these meetings, going to all these wonderful sessions, and then taking it back to apply. So ultimately it shouldn't be as hard as it is for some other small institutions.
So I think it's a good segue in terms of collections to go into the emergency plan. Because collections are part of your emergency plan, but the emergency plan is much more. Of course, your emergency plan is there to ensure the safety and security of your assets, the people who work there, the people who visit, the collections. So I want to start with Anne and ask you about your Connecting to Collections work. I know that you were involved in the Florida program Connecting to Collections, and you were a peer to a number of small nonprofit organizations. And you told me when they started working on the emergency plan, it was actually sort of an aha moment realized something else in the process that ties back to our early collections conversation.
Yeah, I think the Connecting Collections program is still going on in Florida. Basically, they realized that besides hurricanes, there's a number of other risk type things that happen, and over the 440 or so museums in the state of Florida, usually it's about 25%, it was like 10% had an emergency plan. So we started a program to try and help a lot of the smaller institutions write them, and in doing that, I was a mentor to, my group was 5 small, no staff, all volunteer, small budget institutions, and in an emergency plan, despite any other components of it, what most of them realized is they didn't have a clue what they had. So when we're talking about, well, what are you going to say first if a Category 3 hurricane is barreling down on St. Augustine? They were like, what do you mean save first? We're going to save the collections. And we're like, no, you only have 8 hours, and you have to prioritize. So the prioritizing their collection, I don't want to say salvage, since the emergency hasn't happened yet, but prioritizing your collection protection needs. So it was almost, and I would discuss with them, okay, now you only have 10 minutes. What are you going to grab? And they, one person was like, we're going to grab the piano. No, we're going to grab the quilt. And then they just start thinking about, well, can we move a piano? Do we have some place to move the piano? Should we just get the quilt? Well, I like the jacket in the hallway. It's like they had to start thinking about what do they really have and what are the priorities based on who really owns it. So basically, I suggested they started with things that weren't theirs. First, in our case, it was Smithsonian stuff. And then, what's replaceable, so they had to start thinking in terms of, it started all these conversations about a lot of them didn't realize, not only did they not have a collection management policy, they just didn't even really know where their collections were and what they had. So that prioritizing of if I had to save it all, if I could save a portion of it, what would I save? And then of course, God forbid, after an emergency, and you're salvaging things, and can you save the paper stuff versus the grand piano versus the painting, and dealing with, depending on whether it's water or fire or smoke or whatever you're dealing with. So that was the first thing they all realized, is they had no concept of how to prioritize their collections. They all started on based on what they liked the most, and that's not really how it should be. It should be tackled. And then they had to start dealing with what are the even emergencies they thought of. Instantly thought of hurricanes, but one area was really more about flooding versus fires, and they had to start thinking about what are the biggest risks opening to them. And hopefully some of them have finished their plans, but we had, I think, 46 participants, and by the end of a year's program, something like 28 of them had kind of written a draft plan. So it was getting there, but do all 440 in the state have plans? No. And in the country, less than 50% of places.
It's crazy though. I'm just making a little list besides hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, hail, snow, earthquakes, fire, chemicals, and dangerous animals, including
Theft.
active shooters.
Theft, yeah, violence.
I mean, a colleague had a situation last summer where some guy kidnapped a docent at knife point, and the SWAT team came in and shot him in the head right in the lobby of the museum. And, so, you know, there's also aftercare
Yeah.
involved in some of this too, where the staff is still doing counseling. But they weren't prepared for that because who would think that that would be happening? in the-
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to leave the people out, but of course, in any emergency plan,
Yeah.
it's people, stuff, and then your work. So of course, we take care of the people first, but.
Well, and sometime, I mean, getting down to, well, where do you start and how do you do this? This is an area where beyond a written template, area, security or, you know, police and other emergency personnel can come in, and they're well skilled at reminding individuals who work in a place, you know, what to do under these certain, you know, sort of generically these emergency situations, and then you add in the collections. But I've always found that, you know, useful as an employee at different places too. You just are reminded what to do and to look after, you know, create a system to look after your coworkers, look after the stuff. So it's a small thing.
Yes, there are tons of resources out there on disaster preparedness, planning, templates, training, resources, not from local first responders to individuals like you're talking about. The IMLS, the connecting to collections is, I think it's in other states.
Yeah, no, it is.
It's broad throughout the U.S. So many good resources. I know there's a couple other sessions here at the conference that really get into the details. So I highly encourage you to, you know, take advantage of those resources. And I think you bring up I like what Art was talking about, the whole variety of the different types of emergencies. When you think of emergency plan, you think, oh, that means we're gonna have like a flood or a tornado or something. There are so many other types of emergencies, and the ones that you're probably gonna experience the most are those not big, giant natural disasters. It's more of the mechanical issues, pipe burst, sort of the day-to-day things, issues with visitors, a disturbance, or something like that. And those are the things that the training is critical to have. And I think one of you, when we were talking earlier, just talked about the importance of drills and training, so everybody knows this. And because people come and go, and you need to keep it up to date, it does take regular, more frequent review than probably some of the other documents we've talked about. And the recovery piece that we've been talking about is one of the most underestimated and omitted parts of people's policies. It's all about, again, sort of the big catastrophic type of things. They leave out collections, they leave out recovery. You need to have a section on, list those conservators at the end, who's there to take care of paper, recovery, conservation, phone numbers, triage steps, that kind of thing. And working with your first responders for them to understand what your priority needs to, because, you know, they're gonna come in with fire hoses, and they're not necessarily gonna care what they're just sort things at your museum
Yeah.
are first. So having that two-way conversation with them.
The Getty has, you know, been planning for the big one forever.
Yeah.
And they have very detailed plans. Can I give you an example? Another thing to think about is, okay, you're gonna get your collections out of there, where are they gonna go? And if you remember back in 1988, when Yellowstone mostly burned, at the Museum of the Rockies, we had an agreement with the Park Service, and as the fires were coming, they evacuated all their collections out of the park to our basement in Bozeman. And they were there for about a year before they, you know, the museums didn't actually burn down, but it took about a year for everything to go back. But that was prearranged, so it wasn't a surprise, it wasn't a big deal. And our people, I wasn't there yet, but our people pitched in and helped with that evacuation. So, you know, that's another thing on the back end that you might think about.
Right, so think about the entire sort of
Right.
cycle of this. That's why, well, it's a long, cumbersome name, but that's why it's called disaster preparedness and emergency recovery plan. It encompasses all that. And you did mention to me that you, when you were at the Tiki, had a hurricane, and what some of the lessons learned based on about your disaster plan after that happens.
Well, we did
Yeah.
not have a plan when Wilma came through, which is the same year with Katrina and everything else. And we certainly prepared in a minimal way, in the sense that we knew it was coming, and so people got off work and we kind of put some things away outside, because all of us know as homeowners what to do. But we did lose like half our roof, and it was quite extensive damage, and we realized it was the recovery part, that we weren't, lots of people, everybody wanted to go in and help afterwards and pick up branches and start cleaning up and doing stuff, and that was, everything worked out well, so to speak, everything went okay, but we realized afterwards we had nothing in place to decide if 20 of the staff do show up to help clean up, who should really be there, who should be in charge. It goes back to the ICS training and all that stuff, if you're able to get to that. But it basically went to the fact that everybody wanted to be helpful and wanted to do stuff, and God forbid nothing bad happened, but somebody could have got injured, or we could have compromised the collections worse than they were, or the roof could have, collapsed or something. So that's what caused us to really take a couple of years to write a good plan, which is sort of silly. You should think like Hurricane Florida. Come on, how are you not prepared for that? But we weren't really prepared for any sort of emergency since then. And honestly, the one that came up more often after that was animals, bears and alligators. That's what we had more often than anything than hurricanes, was them coming up to the doors and trying to get the people safe. And so that was more about people than collections. So it's all the stuff that you can think about the obvious ones, but you're absolutely right. It should include all of those things. And it is still collection sort of soup to nuts, because it's like, well, if you're going to move them, where do you move them to? And then if they get damaged, how do they get prepared? And then if they get stolen, how do you get them back? I mean, it really does come back to that. So so we kind of were forced into writing one out of the obvious emergency, but then between bears and alligators and things, that's what came up more often than anything.
Right.
Did you have a restaurant?
No, but we did end up, we had garbage cans, and that's what, bears, right? So we ended up getting bear-proof garbage cans and sort of salt them. Gators, there's nothing else you can do.
Great.
Other
Well,
than
we
eat
are
'em.
Yeah.
5 minutes standing between us and lunch. So I want to give the
Speaking of
panel
hungry.
the final opportunity. Are there any other tips, resources, or kind of final thoughts on emergency plans and collection management policies that you want to share your wisdom with the attendees? And then if you have any last second questions, we can tackle those too.
Yeah, both the Mountain Plains Regional Museum Association and Southeastern Museum Conference sent work crews after Katrina, down to Louisiana for 3 weeks. These are people who took vacation from their jobs. The registrars committees in those regions
Yeah.
were very active, and they organized that work. So
And
that's
there's
another resource.
CERT teams still, or it's not called CERT anymore, but there used to be
Yeah.
regional teams that would come out and help. Because in theory, if you get hit by a hurricane, I might not, and they can
Right.
still help each other. But if I have one word, it's train, practice, practice, practice. Do tabletops, train. It seems funny, nobody wants to do it, nobody wants to have a fake fire drill, nobody wants to pretend, but I kid you not, it really is important.
Well, the only thing I would add is just very generically, especially since, there's this wonderful series of conferences that we're participating in right now, is to network with your peers. I mean, your neighbors, and do it often, because you have shared interests and you have shared experience, and especially with regard to emergency preparedness, the kinds of issues I'm from earthquake country, or you're from hurricane country. If you're here in the Southwest, that's not what your problem is likely to be, but you're, just
Forest fires.
Forest fires.
keep up your
Yeah.
networking, because you all have a lot of knowledge.
And this whole thing, including the slides, will be up on the Sustainable Heritage Network.org in about 2 or 3 months.
Yeah. And I would just say that there are, just in terms of the relevance and the issues that are coming up when you use samples, just be clear that sometimes don't waste your time. Think about the issues that are most relevant to you. Again, so if you borrow a sample policy and you are in the middle of Kansas, you probably don't need to have a hurricane policy. So think about the customization again. That's just sort of a reminder.
But flooding in Iowa,
Yeah.
always that,
Right. And you can't cover every possible scenario that could ever happen. So the point of the document is, both of these documents that we've talked about really is set in the parameters and the guidelines to best mitigate problems and deal with them once they happen. You can't prevent every disaster in
questions?